Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome to the episode 79, and it's Friday, the 30th of September, 2022. So what are we going to be looking at today? We're going to be looking at digital. We're going to be looking at the whole area of client listening, which is a really interesting and important area. And we're also going to be looking at how do we actually think about the future. New ways of thinking about the future. So there you go. As always, I've got an amazing panel, so I'll just switch to myself. Just to say hi, I'm Richard Chaplin, and welcome. And I'd like to know and quickly show you my amazing panel from today. So I will start by introducing you to Claire Rason. And Claire's got an interesting background. She is, I think you're always a lawyer, actually, once you qualify. I think that's right. Anyway, she's a lawyer, legally qualified, but these days does many different things, including having been in South America and being very involved in the British Embassy. We might talk about that later, maybe not. And she set up a business which looks at the whole area of client listening. In other words, how can you actually merely make sure you understand what your client needs are? Because if you don't understand what the needs of your clients are, it's pretty unlikely that you will then deliver the services that are right for that particular client. And our second panelist presenter today is Mariusz Kowalski, which he just told me is the most popular name in Poland. I didn't know that before, so there you go. That's a bit of useful information for everybody today. Mariusz has been working in professional services, particularly legal sector, for more years than he and I could probably care to remember. But anyway, as in-house within a firm called Rason, and based in Warsaw, but across the Nordics. And then more recently, as a consultant with Waterwalk Partners. And he has been, if you like, finding that actually the pandemic is quite interesting because he can talk to his clients across the whole of the area without necessarily go to see them. Or if he goes to see them, he will meet one, but the other four are all on Zoom. So why bother to go in the first place? So actually that he's found has been really helpful in terms of building a very effective practice. And he's come to talk today about digital transformation. So before we get on with the polls, I'd just like to kind of just take you through some forum news. And the first point I'd like to make is that, and you may know this anyway, but lots of people are watching the videos from today's and other shows. So please, please, please make sure that you watch those shows because they're really, really good. Our second point is that there are over 50 active mentorships in the Mentor Match, which, as you know, is the system that we've come up to help people, bring people together, and also to give them a secure place where they can then actually progress every step of the mentorship. So that's something that please think about that, because we have over 50 people more than 50 people, 50 mentorships have already been created. I spoke to you a couple of weeks ago about our peer groups, and I said that there are the 2 taster peer groups, which went really well for EAs, executive assistants. A number of managing partners said, we'd really like our executive assistants to come together. Could you organize a peer group for them? So we said, okay. And we've had a couple of tasters and they went really, really well. As we speak, as it happens, there's an HR peer group and the second one taking place, another taster. And we've had a lot of interest in one for chief marketing officers. Otherwise, more forum events are planned over the next few weeks, and that includes the first in-person management team together session since March 2020. And that's really exploring ways to maintain your firm's culture. So what are we going to talk about today? Well, as you know, the forum polls are a very important part of what we do and very much part of today's show. And the one today in particular, which is our quarterly tracker. So hopefully you'll have a chance to complete that in a few minutes' time. Before we go on to this month's this fortnight's tracker, what I'd like to do is basically just talk you through the last one that you guys completed for those that you were on the show 2 weeks ago. And this was to do with the impact of lockdown. And what's quite interesting with that was this is a poll we'd asked, I think, 3 times in the middle of July last year, just before lockdown ended, 3 months later in September, and then 2 weeks ago. And one of the key questions was, what was the overall impact of lockdown on your firm? With the options being sort of positive, negative, and neutral. And A year ago, 14% of firms said that the impact was positive. 2 weeks ago, 69% said it was positive. And that's a massive shift, a little bit like the opinion polls in favour of Labour over the last week, if you're into UK politics. And any further thoughts on that? No, other than saying that this, I think, does actually change. It just says that after a year, yes, we did have an amazing year. Yes, we did manage to shut down the office that one senior partner wanted to keep open and improve our margins. We did a lot of useful and interesting things. So what's the general mood? As you'd expect, therefore, more positive, people more relaxed about being in the office, much more flexibility about working hours when in the office, which is also quite important. Happiness levels have increased, but there's obviously still something of a what should we say, almost a focus around the issue of medical health and mental health issues, because there was a very, very significant increase in medical health issues during the pandemic. And to be honest, that hasn't really reversed. If anything, it's almost gone in the other direction. So that's something that I know a number of firms are looking at and thinking about, okay, everybody, most people may be relaxed, but those that aren't, they may be the ones that we should be really paying attention to. Very few offices, everybody's going to change their office and do this and do that. Hasn't happened. Very few offices have had any sort of significant changes. Most people have done a few things, but no, pretty much that's gone back to normal, if you like. And then I asked them again a year ago, how many of you think that there will be more lockdown restrictions in the next year? That was at 73% a year ago, which is really quite a big number. It's only 15% now. But, and this is always a but in life, isn't there? If you look into the next decade, in other words, if you look 10 years on, at that stage, 30% think there's going to be another lockdown in the next decade. In other words, we've kind of got out of that kind of, it's fine, it's only once every 100 years stuff. We're now a little bit more aware that, these things do come along, whether it's the massive storm in Florida or whether it's a pandemic or I don't want to mention this probably a bit too close to Mariusz, but the war in Ukraine. So there are a whole range of things which are happening, which I think are suggest that people are a little bit less complacent about the future than perhaps they were before. So I'm just going to show you some quick slides, and I appreciate that these may not be very clear because sometimes some of you are looking at these on a small screen. So what are we saying here? Well, we're looking here. The one to watch for is the blue one. And the blue one is basically the latest poll. That was the 16th of September. And as you go to the right, it gets more positive. So if you take the orange one, which was as at a year ago, it was 14% over on the one called positive, second from the right, was got that wrong. And the blue was at 69%. Interestingly, back in July, before the lockdown, everybody thought that it was going to be more positive. Then they weren't sure. Now they're definitely sure it is good. So that's the first one. That's quite interesting. Second one I'll just show you quickly here is the general mood. And this is a little bit more nuanced because the orange, which was before the end of lockdown, there were some people who were over to the far right, which is kind of elated at the thought of lockdown ending. That's kind of fallen away. But there's a general move, if you look at the blue one, away towards a 4 out of 5. In other words, 4 being, pretty good, 3, 2, and we don't have 1. I just called it panic. But anyway, don't think anybody's scoring that anymore, luckily. I think there were a few who were actually way back, but things change, don't they? So that was quite interesting. The other one, I'll just give you a little bit of a snapshot here as to what's of the sort of changes, because this one was about people being in the office. And the red were people who were apprehensive, and the blue were people who were relaxed. And what's very obvious, if you go back to, I think I started this one looking at it in round about the summer of 2020, and there were about 70% of people who were apprehensive and less than 10 who were relaxed. That even dropped to about 0% in August, I could see, end of July. And then gently over the last year. But what was quite interesting was that when lockdown was lifted, which is about in the middle of the chart, around about 1st July, at that stage, still, the more people were apprehensive than relaxed. Now, the numbers don't add up to 100 because there's a big group in the middle called neutral, and that's as it should be. But I just really wanted to show that there is now about 60%, I think it is, of people who are relaxed, and about 20% who are apprehensive, and about 20% who are neutral. So you could read into that what you like, but that sort of shows you how the trend as we've been running these polls through the years. So that, I think, is some probably quite interesting charts. So I'll move on from them. Oh, sorry, this was the last one. The last one I was going to show you. Do you think that lockdown restrictions will be reimposed in the UK in the next year? And again, the oranges, the olive a year ago before lockdown, the red, they were all very high 60s, dropped way back to 15. But then, as I said to you today, the blue going to the right, looking for out into the next decade. That's, if you add together the highly likely and the likely, that's about 30% as opposed to 15% who were saying the same answer in the same question in the context of the next year. So those are some of the trends. So let's talk now. Let's move on to our quarterly sector trends tracker, which is obviously a very important poll that we have carried out now pretty much every quarter for going back, well, before lockdown. In fact, it was even, I think it was called Boris Bounce at one stage when Boris took over as Prime Minister. So what do we look at? Well, we're trying to understand the issues being addressed at partner director meetings, business priorities. We look at management activities, barriers to optimal performance. We look at projected activity levels, headcount, new workflow, the extent of home working, office space requirements, and some key metrics for successful firms. It takes a little bit of time, so I'm going to give you 5 minutes if that's okay. So let's have a look. What's coming up today? I'll try to the extent I can to put in context of previous ones. We normally find that the two that are most popular are finance, which is 57%, marketing 57%, and people 57%. So I think that's fairly clear that those are the ones that come through. Things like supply chain never appear, sustainability doesn't appear. Innovation is quite low. That might be interesting for Mariusz. And client service, again, is quite low, which again is very relevant to Claire. So the ones that seem to be the most popular, finance, as I said, marketing and people. That's the first question. Second question, which 3 management activities do you consider will contribute most to helping your firm achieve its goal? Everybody is going for communication. And then the 2 that come through after, well, 3 that come through after that is understanding, motivating others, getting the best from your team, making change happen. All of those, in my experience, are very, very what I call comms-based activities. So it's all about people, and that's important. Number 3, select the top 3 priorities for your firm now the next 12 months, over the next 12 months. Sorry, I can't read. Strategy comes through very strongly. Develop a clear personal strategy. Develop people's skills and capabilities is the other one that's very high. But most of all, increased use of technology today. Now, that isn't always the top one. Very interesting for Mariusz, again, given he's going to be talking about digital transformation, which obviously has an element of technology involved. But as we may find out, it's probably more a people issue than a tech issue. The constraints, what's getting in the way? Fee pressures, that's always quite a high one. Employee turnover. Now, the employee turnover actually was 0 for much of the pandemic. There wasn't any. Nobody left. And then there was the great retirement and the great moving along, and everybody's looking for people. And it's the recruiters are struggling because everybody wants candidates and they can't find them. So it's an unusual situation, but that's the way it is. So what's happening? What about expansion and contraction? Now, this is quite interesting. We had our annual conference of our marketing group here in Forum yesterday, which Claire very kindly was organizing a panel session for. And one of the questions that the chair asked towards the beginning was, how are people feeling about the next, where we're at and where the next year? And this poll today very much, I think, confirms that. Modest expansion is 57%, no change 30, modest contraction 14. So overall the sector remains pretty bullish, which is quite the case. Now, that's for the level of activity. If I move on to the next one, which is the flow of new work, pretty much the same message emerges. And then in this case, it's all either expansion or no change with no contraction. And then if we look at headcount, again, nobody's looking to reduce their headcount. They're just, how can we get the people to do the work is much more relevant. So again, modest expansion there. So where are those people going to come from? Our clients going to continue to give us the work? There's a number of issues there which might be interesting to explore with the panel today. Office space requirements, everybody pretty much about the same. No real changes there. Everybody's now settled down to whatever the new normal feels like in terms of office usage. Whereas people are spending around half the time at home, and for between a half and a quarter, which is kind of ties in with about a 3-day week in the office, which is kind of what I think is emerging. And then what are these statements? That leaders share strategic options, 86%, employees are valued at least as highly as other stakeholders, 71%. Shared pain, not so strong. Leads are accessible, 86. Transparent, less so, 57. There is then a question about remote working having increased productivity. Jury's out on that, about 50-50, I think. And then you are, and this again, I think is a really interesting one, particularly for Claire. When you're looking at post-COVID success, our firm is on track, say 43% of you. Our key clients are on track for post-COVID success. None of you. So are you therefore possibly in a state where you think you can get lots of new work, but your clients are still struggling? Because if you are, and you're not listening to them, you definitely won't get that work. So I'm going to kind of close the poll down now. Thank you all for completing it, and we'll put the usual summary up shortly once I have a chance to share it with government. And I will now invite our first presenter, which is Claire Rason, to come and share her thoughts on client listening. Over to you, Claire.
Thanks, Richard. So I think I've got about 5 minutes, and this is a topic that I could talk about until the cows come home. So just some kind of initial thoughts, really. And where I want to start is, I was thinking about what I could bring today, and I was reflecting on lockdown, and actually I haven't really thought about lockdown and where we were the first lockdown for a long time. And what the poll has kind of caused me to do is reflect back and think about what was happening then, particularly with clients. So I talk to lots of clients, and at the time, I think we were in a period of a lot of uncertainty. Clients were fearful of their future. Staff were worried about the change. Business owners were worried about the change. And the clients that I spoke to at that time, a lot of them said to me, nobody is picking up the phone to me. No one is asking me whether I'm okay. And there was a real cry from the clients that I was talking to for empathy. Fast forward to now and reflecting on where we currently are. And it's interesting, Richard, you mentioned the Boris bounce, and I was wondering whether with trust it's going to be the trust tumble or something. But anyway, we're in a period now where we're hearing things like the Great Resignation. I think that's moved way now to quiet quitting. The cost of living is obviously something that's concerning many of us. There's a lot of uncertainty around the economy. And I wonder whether we're in a period of time which is very similar actually to where we were back in the first lockdown. What do clients want with regards to client listening? And I've already mentioned that empathy word. And I've already mentioned that, back in the first lockdown, something I heard again and again was that clients just wanted to be heard. They just wanted to be listened to. And I think that there is a real need for clients to be able to tell their advisors where they are and what they need. And interestingly, the panel that I chaired yesterday at the conference, I think that a theme that came across all of the clients was the need for advisors to have a dialogue with them, to understand what their needs were, because only in doing that is it possible to exceed the expectations that clients have. So, Richard, I think in your kind of notes to me, you kind of let me know that one of the focuses of today is priorities for leadership teams. So what are, for me, the priorities for leadership teams when it comes to client listening? And I think for me, the first thing is to make sure that you are listening to your clients. I do a lot of formal listening, but I think the need for informal listening is as important as it was at the start of the pandemic. And I think that need has always been there. I think one of the things that's interesting and that we can perhaps explore later on in the discussion is something that, again, Richard has already raised today, that the way that we listen to our clients, I think, has changed. I think before the pandemic, advisors were used to meeting their clients in person. Meetings allow for that kind of chit chat in the reception or waiting for everyone to sit down and join. And I think that the world has changed, and I think that clients now expect to be listened to in a slightly different way. And again, I can expand on that later on in the conversation today. But I think this idea of adapting and making sure that we realise that perhaps, and again, it's where you ended, Richard, that we're perhaps not in the same position as some of our clients. And therefore, the only way that we can possibly meet their needs is by really opening up and understanding where they are and what we need to do to meet them where they are. I think that's 5 minutes. So I've thrown lots of ideas in there, and I'm sure there are hopefully lots of threads that can be picked up later on in the conversation, but hopefully that provides some food for thought, Richard.
Thanks, Claire. That's really good. Yeah, I agree with you. I think there are some really interesting themes. I like your point around the way that people listen and share ideas has changed with the fact that so much is nowadays on Zoom, as we are today, of course. So if I may now, I will switch to our second panelist. Welcome, Mariusz. Mariusz, I mentioned before, is based in Poland, as you may have gathered, and is the, I think I'm correct to say, the director and CEO, that's the right word, of Waterwalk Partners, that helps law firms in particular, professional firms in general, with a whole range of different areas. But I've asked him to talk today a bit about digital transformation, because that's something that I think a lot of managing partners in particular and leaders struggle with, if only because, much like me, they were born and still quite hanker after what you used to call an analog world. Over to you, sir.
So, good morning, everyone. And today I just want to share with you 3 points concerning digital transformation. And Claire talked a lot about client listening, and I will actually start with that as well. So my point number 1 is reach out to your clients, talk to them instead of just focusing on internal discussions, because ultimately clients are beneficiaries of your digital transformation. So listen to what they say, listen to what is important for them, what are their digital transformation plans, ambitions, and challenges. And I believe that such conversations will actually help you answer a number of your own questions. And of course, you will also gain your clients' goodwill, because they will see that you care, that you're genuinely interested in what they do, in helping them solve their issues. They will see that you're prepared to take into consideration what they say. So that's number 1. Number 2 is that my experience is that IT and technical issues are not necessarily the most difficult ones. Digital transformation is a nice buzzword, but it will not magically solve all your other problems. So if you have serious issues in the organization and you think that digital transformation will fix it all, then most probably it will lead to an even bigger mess with new problems adding to the old ones. And then it will take more time and resources to solve your already existing problems and new ones. So kicking a can down the road is not a good combination with digital transformation. So if you start your digital transformation journey, it may turn out that first you need to fix some other issues, which are often not exactly IT or technical. And sometimes it may be even a complete surprise for you. So that's my second point. And then the third one and the last one, focus on what is truly important for your business. It's interesting because it may sound obvious, but it's actually less obvious when you dig in. And Richard, you just said that, top 3 priorities in the poll. Number 1 was increase use of technology, 71%, number 1. But then, do you talk about that? Well, not really. So 3 areas that normally carry the most weight during partner director meetings: innovation and new technologies, 14%. So do you really know what's important for your business? So when I see these results, then I really see that, it's really not that obvious to know what's truly important for your business. Because if you don't discuss it, how do you know what's important, what's not? And how do you find out? I mean, you need to find out yourself, because obviously answers will differ from firm to firm. And where to start? I think a few questions may be helpful. For example, what can we do to stay ahead? Instead of looking at, technologies, think about what can you do to stay ahead, which are really important areas we should look at. Then also, law firms have a lot of data. And I believe that using your data efficiently can be a goldmine. So how do you use your data? What do you do with it? So it's up to you to find out what's truly important in your context. And then when you find out, focus on it. Don't overdo. Don't try to address all your needs. Focus on what really matters. So it's obviously not everything you need to know about digital transformation, but just hopefully a bit of inspiration and food for thought. So
I think that was a really helpful summary. I'll pick up with Claire first, if I may, and just pick up some of your points. Was Trust Tumble just kind of came like that? I mean, that is just such a wonderful putting 2 words together. For anyone who's in the UK at the moment, it's just like watching a train crash, and we usually say in slow motion. I think this one is rather fast, actually, personally. So let's go back to the question about, are you the formal and informal? And you mentioned that you do, I think, quite a lot of formal listening. But I'm sure when you're talking to clients, you talk about the importance of informal listening as well. So what sort of balance should people be looking for, do you think, between formal and informal listening?
So I think often when firms talk about client listening programs, they are thinking about the formal side of things. What do I mean by that? I mean by, scheduled relationship meetings where you go and the whole meeting is dedicated to listening and finding out where your client is, and often within that, what you do well, where you can improve, but also some horizon scanning. So that's what I mean by the formal listening. But I think often firms overlook the informal, and I think that historically the informal happened anyway. So I think that you would have had as I said, those water cooler moments, I guess, with your clients where, you might have gone out for lunch, or you might have met for coffee, or, you would have been meeting in offices where you would have had the opportunity to catch up quickly in the corridor. And I think that with the shift towards hybrid working, and, as you mentioned there, I think people are still spending a lot of time at home. Meetings are increasingly now happening via Zoom or Teams or whatever format you favour. And I think what that has now created is an environment where you often just jump straight into the meeting. And so those informal chats that perhaps you had before are becoming less frequent. And I think that there is a need for everyone to start to think about, well, how can I start to create those informal opportunities to be able to hear what my clients are saying, and how do I capture that? Because I think again, I think we're very good at perhaps having those formal conversations, recording, coming back, thinking about how we action what we're hearing. But I think often we get so much from those informal opportunities that we have with our clients. But we're not very good at bringing that information back, sharing it, and thinking about the themes that we're getting and what we can do with those themes.
Yeah, we'll talk about data sharing in a minute. Thanks very much, Claire. That was really helpful. Mariusz, if I could just pick up one of the points you were making, which I thought was quite interesting, when you were, again, staying in the area of client listening, but you were looking at my notes, you were saying that actually it's really quite helpful to talk to your clients about their digital transformation plans and challenges, because they are also going on the same journey. Now, how do you help the managing partner, the leader, who feels that, but like maybe some people, well, I don't really understand any of this digital stuff, so I desperately, as a good lawyer, would never want to be in a position where I showed that I didn't know something, and that would be just really difficult. So how would you begin a conversation with a client around their digital plans in your experience?
Well, one approach may be to actually involve your wider team. I remember this MPF research paper from a few years ago, when clients were saying it's important for us to have contacts, on a C-suite level between law firms and clients. So, you probably have your IT people, your innovation managers. Why don't you ask them? Why don't you delegate? I mean, you as a managing partner, you don't have to do everything yourself. I would involve other people and ask them to talk with their peers on the client side. And I think this way, I think it can, first of all, it's another sort of touch point with the client organization. And these people will probably have a better conversation. And then, they will probably also be able to have less formal conversation. So I think sort of involving a wider team can be helpful.
And coming on to Claire, I mean, staying with the same question in a way, is client listening is also another very important activity. To what extent is that a shared exercise across the firm, or is it something that you would find a particular team who go out and make sure that they are the ones who are great at collecting data, maybe, or collecting information and then sharing it, as opposed to everybody doing it, but then going back to your previous point, data sharing being a little bit more challenging?
So I want to actually pick up on something that you asked in the previous question, which is, how, I can't remember how you phrased it, but something around, entering into a dialogue when perhaps you don't have the answers. And that for me is really key to this whole exercise of listening. So I approach listening, I'm a coach. And as a coach, I've been trained to listen, and active listening, I know, is a real buzzword at the minute. And for me, active listening is really key when it comes to so many things. And I think everybody should have some degree of knowledge around what active listening is. And I think often as advisors, we are taught to advise. We are there to provide answers a lot of the time. And that is the space where we feel comfortable. And I think that there is a shift from being the person who provides the solution, who provides the answers, to being someone who asks the question and listens and doesn't necessarily have any answers or doesn't necessarily know what the solution is. And I think that shift is one which I think often provides a huge opportunity, but I think is often something that makes people feel uncomfortable with this idea of listening. And digital transformation is a great example. I think I'm someone who, my whole business is based around people, not around technology. And technology is something that I find, difficult to talk about. But actually, if you go into a conversation, you don't have to know the answers. It's about asking the questions, and it's about, raising your hands and saying, what, we're facing this challenge too. Let's together think about how we can come to a solution. So I'm not sure I've answered your question, but if answering your question in a nutshell, for me, everyone should be listening, and everyone should be conscious of when they are in listening mode. And I think it's harder often for the advisors, and the higher up you go, to be able to switch to that listening mode, because we are so often in advisory mode, which requires a whole different skill set.
That's great. I mean, staying with that point for the minute, how if somebody is in that scary space because they've been taught that their job is to give answers, not to ask questions. I mean, if you're an auditor, then, which is my background, asking questions just feels completely normal because you spend your first X years of life doing nothing but ask questions, and people have to give you answers as well. But I think for lawyers it's somewhat different, and or possibly engineers or people who are very, very specialist in their arena. But so how in your experience do you prepare somebody for that scary space? Is it a training issue? How do you actually help them?
I think it is a training issue, and I feel if I say that I'm being self-serving, because that's what I do. But I think, one of the reasons I love coaching is, at its heart, it's about raising awareness. And I think often we don't recognize that we have that discomfort, or we recognize that we feel discomfort, but we don't know why. And I think that for me, the key is understanding that, if we truly want to listen to our clients, and we truly want to be transformative, or we truly want to innovate, that means putting ourselves in a space where, the only purpose of a conversation might be to hear what's being said. And I think that the shift is, my background is legal. I'm a solicitor by training. We are also trained to ask questions, but we are trained to ask questions with a view to come up with an answer, and often come up with an answer quite quickly. Whereas often, particularly in the digital transformation space, we might be asking questions, and actually the conclusion is, thank you, I've heard what you've said, and I'm going to take it away and reflect on it, speak to other people about it, and do something slightly different with what I'm hearing. So yes, I think training plays a big part, but within that training, it's raising awareness of discomfort and owning it, and recognizing that that's okay, that's natural.
Thanks very much. I'm coming back to Mariusz now, again, perhaps moving on from the client listening area that you were talking about before, but saying that the IT and tech issues are not always the hardest, that digital transformation is a bit of a buzzword, and often if you have serious issues, it's not the answer at all. What sort of issues have you, I mean, again, don't mention names, but what sort of, when you're talking to some of your clients about some of their issues, I mean, what sort of things are people thinking are digital issues, but in reality are something else? Can you give some examples possibly?
Yeah, well, I mean, one very simple example is you do a marketing campaign, and then you realize that you have a very fancy system, but some of your email addresses are still not correct. And this is not an IT issue. It's a very simple example, but but you see it all the time. You've got to have somebody in your team handling this piece of work, and it's just not addressed within the organization. Then, of course, you may have just Excel sheets, which cost you less, and still have data which is not correct. But then if you have a super fancy, very expensive system and your data is not good, then something is wrong. And this is not exactly IT issue. It's about, I would say very often is, you pick solutions that require resources in your organization, that require, attention from sort of teams within the firm. But there are no such resources, or there are not enough such resources. So there is a mismatch between, okay, are we really capable of handling these solutions? So I think it's a very much management sort of organizational issue to look at, okay, are we capable of sort of really using these tools we are talking about? So I don't know whether this answers your question.
Well, no, it's a great example. I mean, I think also then possibly picking up some of the other issues where I sense that the strategy was almost as well as the tactical emails, but where the strategy was out of place, and everybody was kind of thinking about where they want to be in 3 years and what that's going to look like, but then they haven't actually put in all the steps in place in order to get there. And for many people, the digital transformation is about efficiency. Well, actually, I always think that the best CIO is the one who identifies a technological solution, brings it to the conversation, and then as a result of which the strategy is changed rather than it being there just to support the strategy. So have you found sort of examples of that where the technology has driven the strategy rather than just being supportive of the strategy?
Absolutely. And I think that this is actually, in my view, one of the characteristics of a truly innovative firm. And then it's also a sign that your IT function has a strategic role, because otherwise it's, like keeping the green lights on. You don't want to have your IT team just making sure that you're keeping the lights on. You want them to be strategic. So absolutely, I think it's, and if you want to have a successful digital transformation, I think it's also important to have IT people who are ready to assume such strategic role, because this is also not given. If you're an engineer, you may not exactly feel comfortable or be properly educated to be a strategy advisor to your management team.
Which comes back to recruitment, I suppose. I mean, coming back to Claire for a minute, if I may, and just we looked a little bit about the whole area of empathy, and to what extent do you think empathy is harder when people are online and it's actually getting in the way, and other ways to compensate for that?
So I don't think empathy is harder online. I think empathy is about, I mean, there are, again, this is a topic I could kind of go off in a rabbit hole with, because there are different types of empathy, but I think fundamentally empathy is about understanding. And I think it was interesting, again, I'm going to reflect back to the client panel yesterday, that I think sometimes the basics, we worry about, the next shiny thing, we worry about the next amazing piece of technology. And the example given about, you can have the best piece of technology, but if the email address is wrong, the technology can't help you solve that. And actually, I think oftentimes we forget the basics. And I think actually, fundamentally, empathy is about understanding your clients. And I think you can do that online, you can do that in person, but I think that it's perhaps easier to forget to do it online, and we don't take those moments to pause. And I think we need to be more conscious of the moments that we have with our clients and make sure that we take advantage of those and we use them to understand and meet our clients where they are.
Wonderful. Now that's really interesting. I think, as you say, we could talk about empathy for a long time, and it's based in EQ, and it's really self-awareness. And I think a lot of people find it difficult to empathize with somebody else if they're not self-aware in the first place, and that isn't something that they teach you in law school, sadly.
Well, I'm just gonna before you kind of move on, because one of the thoughts that I had actually is I think when you talk about empathy, we're talking about emotions, and you mentioned EQ there. And I think one of the things that we forget often as advisors, because it's easy to forget because we're not trained in emotion and we're not trained in handling emotion. And it goes back to what we talked about earlier around discomfort, around not knowing the answer. We're not taught to recognize, how are we feeling? What are we sensing? And what's that telling us? And I think that, the more that we do that, the better we become as an advisor. And the better we can become innovative and transformative and bring teams together.
There's most people probably know this, but there's a movement, I think probably the best one, called the O-shaped lawyer, which basically is looking at developing a more rounded approach, and very much looking at the EQ as well as the IQ. Very few people challenge lawyers' IQ, but EQ sometimes, yes, is a little bit harder, I'm sure. Honourable exceptions, you and me, maybe. I'm an accountant, as you probably know. Mariusz, just kind of going back, if I may, and I loved your thought about how this drives, how, well, a number of things, how the management team can talk to each other. I think that's really important, and not just everything being fielded through one person, but then you're hiring people who can contribute, whether it's a director of innovation or equivalent role to the strategy. How do you find, we talked a little bit earlier about using your data effectively. How do you go about that, do you think? That was one of the points I know you raised towards the end of your talk. How do you use it effectively, as opposed to making sure that the thing doesn't fall over, which is the more extreme example possibly, but how do you actually use it effectively?
Well, I think first of all is to probably sort of see what you have. I mean, do we know what we actually have? And then when you realize what you have, is to think, how can we use this huge database to improve our organization, to make us more efficient, to see whether we see any trends in relations with clients. I mean, I think you can really sort of start with it and then, aggregate data, look at it. I mean, you will need to have professionals helping you handle this process. But I would say that quite often law firms are, they just keep their data and they don't really explore. It's an exploration sort of exercise. And here again, I think talking to your clients, listening to them and admitting that you don't have all responses. It's okay to admit that you don't have sort of ready-made responses, and the same with your data. I mean, at the beginning, you will probably not fully be aware of what you have. But then if you, also talk to your clients, look at your processes, then it can help you sort of organize, aggregate your data and find ways to really use it to improve your business. Yeah.
Thanks. Staying with data for a minute, Claire. Just to give a simple example, we had a lovely conference yesterday, and we will send out some what are sometimes called online happy sheets. How many smileys you get, and everyone think that's great. And all the research I've done suggests that very little then happens to that learning data. How do you make sure that the client listening data is being effectively shared within a firm, in your experience?
So there's lots there. So, and actually it's interesting because I think that the action point and the sharing point do go hand in hand. So I hear again and again when I have conversations that clients are very open to sharing feedback, but there is nothing more frustrating for a client than sharing feedback and then not having it actioned. And actually, oftentimes firms will action what they've heard, but they won't then go back to that client and say, thank you for the information that you gave me. Off the back of what you told us, this is what we've done. And I think often, we do action, we don't close that loop. Now, in terms of sharing internally, I think that there are lots of different ways that we can go. And I think often it's easier with quantitative data, where we have aggregated data, where we can share results of surveys, where it's anonymous. The data that I collect is often qualitative, and it's often with one client about one relationship. But what I always encourage firms to do is think about the themes that come from the different qualitative sources that you've got, and think about who needs to hear those themes. Because often what we will do is we will think about a conversation about a relationship, the client team will find out about the results, but perhaps issues are being raised that are relevant to the IT director or to the HR director or to the marketing director, and that information doesn't get fed back. So I would say think about what you're receiving from conversations, consider it as data, because I think that's a shift in mindset that often we don't think about that as data, but think about it as data and think about who is this useful to share with, and how can I share it, and if I need to share it anonymously, that's fine. And often with client conversations, it does need to be fed back anonymously. Hopefully that answers the question.
Well, it's not really answering the question, but it's certainly you're putting some lovely, rich thoughts into a kind of more basic skeleton that I've been sharing with you, which is always. I remember that David Maister said time ago, the sort of, the firms run excellent vacuum cleaners, but don't seem to do anything with the data. That's a sort of a simple analogy. Or the wrong people. This goes back to comms 1.0. You need to know who the audience is. You need to know what the message is. You need to know what the channels are, and you need to know what are the pumps and brakes that are actually getting you from A to B. So what I'll do now is I will move to the final stage of today's call, which is to we'll move to gallery mode, and to invite our three great panelists, well, two great panelists, but me, but I think I'll probably, is to just reflect on what's the one thing that has come up in today's conversation and that you think is particularly interesting that you would like to share with today's audience. What's the one thing? We'll start with Mariusz, if I may. What's the one thing that you've come up with that you think has really today has been, I hadn't thought of that, the aha moment, sometimes they call it in social anthropology.
I think it's okay not to know the answers. It's okay. And your clients also may not know the answers. But if you are prepared to reach out to them, talk to them, I think we talked a lot about empathy, and it's very much sort of empathetic exercise. You go to them, you say, okay, we don't know what we'll achieve, but we want to share this, discussion with you. We want to listen to you. And eventually maybe we'll help you sort of find answers to your questions. So that's probably how we put that.
Okay, thank you. And Claire, what's your takeaway from today?
My takeaway, I was thinking about, I don't want to say me too or ditto, as he said. I think for me, it's the importance of listening to clients, but also listening internally. And I think often we forget to do that. And I was reflecting back to when I was in private practice, and actually, the IT team often are the lot, please, get us this, we need it to solve our problem. But actually often we skip the steps and we don't have the initial conversations about, well, what problem are we trying to solve? And how can different people internally help us solve this problem? Because they will come at it with a different perspective and a different viewpoint. So my takeaway is actually, yes, we need to listen to our clients, but we need to listen internally more too.
Fantastic. Well, can I, on behalf of everybody today, thank you all for being a great audience. Thank you for being a great panel. I'd like to thank Claire for sharing her thoughts on client listening and reminding us that, it's something that is not something that you do and then lock up the data inside, but it really is only meaningful if it's actioned. And I'd like to thank Mariusz for reminding us that whilst everybody might think that digital transformation is the answer, in reality, it probably is just a reflection on the problem. So thank you all. We will be back in 2 weeks' time with another panel. In the meantime, have a wonderful day, weekend, and we'll talk soon, I'm sure. Bye for now.